Now we are joined by Dr. Donald Grant, a psychologist. He is the executive director at Mindful Training Solutions. Doctor, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really appreciate it. You've done stories with Dr. Grant. And Dr. Grant, also, you've been part of speaking with all of us, groups here at CBS 2. We appreciate that.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, you're very helpful, as I know you will be right now, too, as we're talking about breaking the stigma. And one of those being a person who has mental illness or suicidal thoughts. It's like, well, that person must be X and fit in this box. Couldn't be further from the truth.
Couldn't be further from the truth. The thing is, if you have a brain, you have mental health concerns. And I think that's some of the level set that we need to have, is that people need to understand, no matter what it looks like from the outside, if you're human, there are risk factors for mental wellness.
Doctor, you know, I talked about in our discussion how sometimes communities of color may be less likely to talk about mental health. And it takes a while to find that person that is a good fit to help you. I'm wondering if there's some certain things we should be asking psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists that we may be thinking of working with.
Yeah, it's so important, particularly if you're a person of color, because we know that many of the mental health clinicians out there are not of color, and we need to work hard to get more clinicians of color. But what we know, we want to ask things like, have you ever worked with anybody from my cultural background? Have you had training in, cultural competency or cultural empathy, as I like to call it? How will our cultures impact our engagement and my treatment? And finally, things like, how will you incorporate, different parts of my own culture, my traditions? How will you work to incorporate that into my treatment?
Talk about blame and shame. Be it I'm blaming myself for not doing X, Y, Z, and then on the other side, say a relative of another generation says, oh my gosh, it's my fault, the way I raised the child. Talk about that and how everybody can give themselves a break.
Yeah, shame and blame are such big factors in mental health services, and just approach from the consumer point of view when you want to go see a therapist, and then approach from the familial point of view where parents and family members say, oh, it was my fault. We give a lot of other people more grace than we give ourselves. And so I think it's really important to provide ourselves with some grace. Now, it's also important to be very honest. Some of us have really created environments that have brought forth some risk factors for the people in our worlds, and we really want to acknowledge those so that we can do different, right? And so sometimes we're raising kids in an environment that is riddled with many different risk factors, and we try to put things in place to balance that out. For instance, when we think about the disproportionate number of children who experience poverty, we know that a lot of those parents can't do anything about that at the moment, but you do have to recognize that there may be risk factors associated with that environment that we want to mediate, that we want to take time to sit with our children and fill them with courage and strength if they live in an environment where they're not getting that automatically. And so we got to give ourselves grace, but we also have to acknowledge what really exists.
When you talk about grace, Dr. Grant, speak a little more on that, because isn't there a fine line between giving ourselves grace and not telling somebody I need help?
That is such an important point. So sometimes, because mental wellness has a taboo, no matter who you are, white, black, Latinx, Asian American, Persian, there is a stigma about it. So we want to make sure that when we're talking about grace, we're paying attention to our own insecurities about not just the mental health of our loved ones, but about our own. Because sometimes we're like, I'm not going to push that person because I'm sitting here in my own fog, or I'm sitting here in my own addiction or my own depression, and we have a resistance to actually pushing someone and say, oh, we'll give them some grace. The grace I was speaking of is making sure we're not too blaming of ourselves on this road, but we have to ask these hard questions. We have to ask our loved ones, are you in pain? Do you want to hurt yourself? Here's an even tougher one. Do you want to kill yourself? Remember, do you want to hurt yourself and do you want to kill yourself are two very different questions. There are some people who have experienced suicidal ideations who never wanted to hurt themselves, but they certainly wanted to die. And we have to reduce the myth that demonstrates that has historically demonstrated that when we ask someone about suicide, it increases the likelihood that they'll engage in suicidal behaviors. That's been proven scientifically to not to be true. We have to be brave, we have to be bold, and we have to understand that a lot of our engagement on this may be based on our own stuff. And so even though it's an overused analogy, the whole put on your oxygen mask before you put on someone else's, it's so relevant in this situation because we need people in order to keep somebody else safe who may be in a very precarious situation. We got to work on our own stuff as well.
That's so true, Doctor. You know, when we were talking about when we don't have supportive people around us, how, and very often, as you said, it's young people who don't have a supportive parent or somebody to go to. What advice do you have for them?
Well, we have to recognize some of these statistics, right? We understand that between the ages of 18 and 25 are some of the largest mental health concerns with that group, and they are some of the lowest participants in mental health services across all ethnicities and cultures. What we want to do is try to front load all of our children who we work with, who we teach, who we engage with. We want to provide them with tools to be able to regulate, self-regulate, engage in anger management, all these different things, such that at 18 to 25, when these onsets of so many different disorders happen, they're not left untooled. They're not left without skills, and we want to be able to provide them with some of them. And if we can do our best at putting protective factors in that environment, remember, some environments we can't change. I get that. But we can add protective factors to that environment. Like when we think about people who do certain jobs, they wear protective gear for that job. If you live in a community that is riddled with certain risk factors, we want to do a different job in our home to make sure the people are safe. Whether that means making sure that kids have books where they see themselves and they gain that additional layer of self-esteem so that when they're moving through a community that's riddled with substances of abuse, they may have a higher degree of self-esteem because they had all these books that they read growing up that look like, where they had characters that look like them. Now, I'm not suggesting that reading a book can stop substance abuse, but what I am suggesting is the synergy between all these different things that we do can increase the likelihood of safety in our communities.
You spoke about job, work, our different environments, and Cindy, a perfect example of someone, you know, high pressure, high exposure job, and again, just saying that this can happen to anybody, can have suicidal thoughts. One of the things you speak to groups as a whole, and talking about work stresses, and just could you address those just a little bit more?
Some of us move into the workspace and we have to consistently wear this mask of efficacy, this mask that demonstrates that we don't have a weak moment. And that can be very dangerous, particularly when you're going through one of your vulnerable moments, again, which everybody has. There's not one person who doesn't experience those. A lot of things that I do with workplaces is I help people understand how do we, in fact, curate a workplace where people can bring their full selves to work. We oftentimes talk about that in the framework of, you know, ethnicity and culture, but just as big as bringing your full cultural self to work is bringing your full emotional self to work. We want leaders of the workplace to be able to engage with their teams in a way that says, I don't need you to tell me about all of your mental health concerns because now we're in a HIPAA violation, but I do want you to be able to feel safe enough that you have job security, that you can take off work when you need to. That you don't feel like if I go on this sabbatical, I'm going to lose my job.
Yeah. Doctor, I just want to ask you very quickly, you know, we're all coming out of the pandemic and some people going back to work. Everyone is anxious. What are some things that anyone can do to help feed their good mental health?
Yeah, and that's a great point. Like, so many people are walking into this new open world, and some are feeling a lot of anxiety. Some are feeling like, oh, you know, I'm going to be very tentative about going in, but I don't feel anxious about it. So first thing is honoring your own individualized experience, right? You don't want to let the noise around you dictate how you feel. You want to determine that for yourself. So that's the first thing. then you recognize, wow, I am feeling anxious, not just because the world is telling me I should feel anxious, but because I really do. And so moving very slowly into this reopening is going to be a very valuable tool for a lot of people. Recognizing the pressure that's coming to you externally and acknowledging it. I think one of the major components with anxiety is kind of the thought of the event, and we catastrophize a lot. When we take moments, moment by moment and day by day, we have the opportunity to prepare a little bit more for it. And so I think that it's going to be very important as people look towards going back into their workplaces, going back into shopping malls, sitting inside areas where people are not wearing masks and you don't feel comfortable with that, making deliberate decisions on what you've recognized, not the noise around, but what you take an individual stock in for yourself, because I think that's the key. There's so much noise around the reopening that people are not necessarily authentically having their own experience. And I want people to sit with themselves and figure out their own cadence and move in that way. That's going to help reduce a lot of that anxiety.
Good advice. Really helpful. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you so much. You've helped us so much, as we were saying, you know, previously with other stories and just all your expertise. I thank you for your time.
It's always a pleasure to be with you all.
I was nervous.
Great, right?
I was nervous about all of this.
You did great.
Well, I have to just say, I'm so grateful.
Are you going to cry?
I know, again. But I'm so grateful that you are here to have this important conversation. I'm so grateful to everyone out there who's taking the time to watch this. And I just hope that we open up, we share our issues, we help each other, and we need to break the stigma.
And that we open up, and that we, when we need help, we feel empowered if you can find any bit of that during that tough time. But also for the others in your lives, that we are observant of other people and maybe get our faces out of the technology a little bit.
Oh, definitely.
Helping. I'm so glad you're here. How long have we known each other?
Boy, I know I've been here 28 years, so 28 years.
Well, 30 years. We are really good friends.
We are. We were talking about resources, and first of all, again, thank you for being with us. We do have more resources on how to find help on our website, cbsnewyork.com. You are not alone. There is always help available.
If you or someone you know needs help, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network has a 24/7 crisis hotline. That's 1-800-273-TALK. 1-800-273-8255. You can also text the word TALK to 741-741 to text with a trained crisis counselor anytime for free, which can lead to further help. And I want to say one more thing. There's nothing wrong with crying.
That's very true. And I'm good at that.
Take good care.